My son stood in my kitchen wearing that expensive suit he couldn't really afford, telling me I should sell the lake house his father built with his own hands. He said the house was just sitting there, wasting space, while his wife could be driving something worth the money. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You're so old, Mom. You won't have time to enjoy the money anyway." I just stood there holding my coffee cup, pretending his words didn't cut me. For years I had helped him, paid his debts, covered his mistakes, believed he'd grow out of this selfishness. But that morning, I realized he didn't see me as his mother anymore. To him, I was an obstacle, a wallet with wrinkles. I didn't argue, I didn't beg. I simply nodded and told him I'd think about it. But when the door closed and the silence came back, I made a decision I should have made long ago. I wasn't going to let him take the last thing that still felt like my husband's presence. So, I picked up my phone, called one person I still trusted, and quietly started my own plan. Would you like to know what happened next? It was a cold Vermont morning, the kind where the air feels too still to breathe. I stood in my small kitchen waiting for the coffee to finish brewing. The smell always reminded me of Thomas. He used to make the first pot every morning before heading to the lake. Now it was just me, and the silence that had become too familiar. My hands shook a little as I poured the coffee. The joints don't work like they used to. I was about to sit down when I heard the door open. Mark's voice filled the apartment. "Mom?" He didn't come alone. His wife, Amber, followed right behind him, heels clicking against my old wooden floor like a metronome. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Pretty, polished, and distant. They looked like they didn't belong in this house, or maybe I didn't belong in theirs anymore. "Morning," I said, forcing a smile. "Coffee?" "No, we're good," Mark answered quickly, glancing around my kitchen like he was inspecting it. His tone was polite but sharp. He'd picked that up since marrying her. Amber set her designer bag on my counter and smiled in that way young women smile when they're about to say something they know will hurt. "At your age, Eleanor," she began softly, "you should be enjoying your money. We could help you. Spend it wisely." I looked at her carefully. "Spend it on what?" Mark stepped in, his voice firmer now. "Mom, the house is just sitting there. You never go up to the lake anymore. It's collecting dust. You don't need it." I tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. "It's not wasted to me, Mark. Your father built that house." He sighed like he'd been waiting for that answer. "Dad's gone, Mom. You have to move on. That place, it's just space, dust, memories, wasted space." Those words landed hard. Dust, memories, as if that's all my life was to him now. Amber looked at him, then at me, her tone sweet but cutting. "If we sold it, you'd finally have some real money to enjoy, and we could finally get that car Mark's been talking about." That was when he said it, so casually it almost didn't sound cruel. "Stop being selfish, Mom. You're too old to enjoy the money anyway." For a second I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, the room spinning, the coffee cooling in my cup. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice. He thought I was selfish. After everything. After raising him alone, after paying for his college, after helping with his first failed business. Somehow, I was the selfish one for wanting to keep the last thing Thomas left behind. They left soon after, still talking as if nothing had happened. Amber kissed the air near my cheek and said, "Think about it, okay?" When the door closed, the silence came back, louder than before. I sat down at the kitchen table and finally let myself exhale. My hand was still trembling, holding the same cup I'd been holding when Thomas told me, years ago, that this house would always be our legacy. I stared out the window. The trees outside were bare, their branches reaching toward the lake. I could almost see it from here, the line of pines that led to the water, the reflection of the house he built with his hands. It wasn't just a building, it was a promise. And that morning, I decided I wasn't ready to break it. I drove back to Maplewood Lake that weekend. It had been months since I last went there. The road looked the same as always, full of trees bending over the edges and patches of sunlight on the pavement. I used to love this drive when Thomas was still alive. He'd talk the whole way, telling stories or pointing out deer by the woods. Now it was quiet, and I found myself turning off the radio halfway there because even music felt too loud. When I reached the lake road, I slowed down. The cottage came into view through the trees, just the way I remembered it. The paint was fading a little, but it still looked strong. The porch was covered with leaves, and the small wind chime Thomas had hung there was still moving slowly in the breeze. It felt strange, like time had stopped for everything except me. I parked the car and stood outside for a moment. The smell of pine hit me right away. It smelled exactly like the days when Thomas and I built this house. I could see it in my head so clearly. He was out there 40 years ago, working with his bare hands. He didn't want anyone else to build it. He said, "This house will outlive both of us. Promise me you'll keep it standing." I laughed back then and said, "You're talking like we're already old." He smiled and said, "One day we will be." We were both so sure about everything back then. We thought we'd have forever. He found that little silver wind chime at a roadside shop on our way to buy supplies. He said we should hang it on the porch because it would remind us of the breeze when we weren't here. We hung it up together that evening. It made the softest sound. Every time the wind blew, it felt like the house was breathing with us. I walked inside the cottage and looked around. The air smelled of dust and old wood, but it wasn't unpleasant. It smelled like memories that had stayed put. The chair by the window was still there, the one Thomas always sat in when he wanted to read or drink his coffee. I ran my hand along the armrest. The wood was worn smooth from years of use. On the wall near the kitchen door, there were still faint pencil lines marking Mark's height as he grew. I used to write the years beside each mark. 1991, 1994, 1998. The last one was the year Thomas passed away. That summer comes back to me so clearly. Thomas spent most of it teaching Mark how to fish. I can still see them standing at the dock together, their shadows stretching across the water. Mark was small then, so full of energy, asking questions every 5 seconds. Thomas would tell him to take it slow, to wait for the fish to find the bait. Mark would sigh and say, "Dad, this is boring." And Thomas would just smile and say, "That's how patience feels." I used to sit on the porch with a book, pretending to read but really watching them. I liked hearing their voices mix with the sound of the water and the wind. It was ordinary, but it was ours. Those were the best days I ever had. When Thomas died, I stopped coming as often. The house started to feel too quiet without him. Every creak in the floor, every sound of the chime reminded me he was gone. But today, walking through each room, it didn't hurt as much. It felt peaceful instead, like the house had been waiting for me. I opened the windows to let some air in. The curtains moved gently. I could see the lake through the glass, calm and still, just like always. The same dock, the same water. Nothing about it had changed. Only the people had. I sat down in Thomas's chair and stayed there for a while. I thought about all the years that had passed, about how quickly Mark grew up, how far away he seemed now even when he was standing right in front of me. I thought about what Thomas would say if he could see the way things had turned out. I think he'd be disappointed, not angry, just quietly sad. After a while, I stood up and started cleaning. I wiped the counters, dusted the shelves, straightened the picture frames. There was a photo of Thomas holding Mark as a baby. He looked so proud. I remember taking that picture. It was the day we finished the dock. He had calluses all over his hands, but he was smiling like it was the best thing he'd ever done. I stepped outside again and walked down to that same dock. The boards creaked under my feet. I sat on the edge and looked out over the water. The surface was smooth, the kind of stillness that makes you think time stopped moving. I could almost see them again, Thomas and little Mark, casting their lines, laughing, arguing over who caught more fish. For a moment it felt like they were still there. I whispered, "I kept it, Thomas. I always did." The wind moved through the trees and the chime on the porch rang softly. It sounded exactly the same as it did the day we hung it. That sound always feels like a promise to me, and it made my chest ache a little. I stayed until the sun started to set. The light on the lake turned orange and the cottage looked almost golden in that glow. Before leaving, I walked around the house one more time. I touched the walls, the door, the railing on the porch, as if saying goodbye again. But this time it didn't feel final. It felt like I was promising to come back. Before I got into the car, I looked up at the chime one last time. It swung gently, catching the last bit of sunlight. "I kept it, Thomas," I said again. "I always did." The sound that followed was soft but clear, like the house was answering me. Driving away, I looked at the cottage through the mirror until it disappeared behind the trees. And I knew something for sure. No matter what my son said, no matter what anyone thought, I wasn't letting anyone take that place away. It wasn't just a house. It was everything that was left of us. That night, as I locked my apartment door back in town, the smell of pine was still in my clothes, and I could still hear the chime ringing in my head. I didn't know it yet, but that visit to Maplewood was the beginning of my plan. When they left, the apartment felt too quiet. The door had barely closed, but the air was heavy, like their voices were still hanging in the room. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, holding that same coffee cup until it went cold in my hands. I walked to the living room and sat down in my old chair. The sunlight was softer now, falling across the small table where I kept a few framed pictures. One of them was of Mark when he was about 6 years old. His hair was a mess, and he had that big, proud smile on his face, holding up a fish he caught with his father at the lake. I used to love that picture. I thought it showed who he really was. Kind, curious, full of life. But as I looked at it now, it felt like a picture of someone who didn't exist anymore. That little boy was gone. The man who stood in my kitchen this morning wasn't the same person. Somewhere along the way, I lost him, and I never noticed when it happened. The room stayed silent except for the clock ticking on the wall. I could feel my heart beating faster even though I was just sitting there. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. There was too much anger mixed in with the sadness. I turned my phone over on the table. For a long time, I just stared at the screen. Then I opened my contacts and scrolled down the list until I saw a name I hadn't thought about in years. Laura Kent, Mark's ex-wife. I hesitated. My thumb hovered over her name. She'd always treated me with respect even after the divorce. I remembered the way she used to bring flowers when she visited, how she called me Mom long after things between her and Mark fell apart. For a second, I thought about what I was about to do. It felt wrong and right at the same time. But after everything that had happened, I knew this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about standing up for myself. I took a breath, pressed the call button, and waited. When the line connected, my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Laura," I said softly, "it's been a while. I have something you might want to hear." And with that call, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to save me. I was taking the first step myself. The next morning, I left the apartment early. The city was just waking up, quiet and gray under a soft drizzle. I hadn't slept much. My head kept replaying what Mark said, his words looping through the night like a song I couldn't turn off. Stop being selfish. I'd heard many things from him over the years, but that one stuck. It kept echoing long after he was gone. I walked to a small cafe downtown, the Lantern Cafe, a place I hadn't been to in years. It used to be where Thomas and I stopped for breakfast when we came into Burlington for groceries. It smelled exactly the same. Roasted coffee, cinnamon, and rain on the pavement outside. I got there early, 15 minutes before the time I'd agreed on. I sat in the corner near the window facing the street. My hands were wrapped around the coffee cup, not because I wanted to drink it, but because I needed something to hold. I kept glancing toward the door, waiting. When she walked in, I recognized her right away. Laura Kent. She looked almost exactly the same, maybe a little sharper around the edges, a little stronger somehow. Her dark hair was pulled back, her blue suit neat and pressed. She carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence you only earn after surviving something painful. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, smiling gently as she approached. Her voice hadn't changed. Polite, calm, but warm. "Please," I said, standing to greet her. "Call me Eleanor. You haven't been my daughter-in-law for a long time." She sat down across from me, and for a few seconds we just looked at each other. I didn't know where to start, but she did. "I was surprised when I saw your name on my phone," she said softly. "It's been, 3 years?" "Almost 4, I answered. "You look well." "So do you," she said, though we both knew it wasn't true. The waitress came by and took her order. When she left, we were alone again. The sound of the espresso machine filled the silence between us for a moment. "I heard about Mark," she said after a pause. "Someone mentioned he remarried." I nodded. "Amber, she's young." Laura smiled faintly. "They usually are." We both laughed quietly, not out of humor, but because there was nothing else to do with that kind of truth. She stirred her coffee, looking thoughtful. "So, what made you call me after all this time?" I looked down at my hands. "Mark came to see me yesterday. He wants me to sell the lake house." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "The one Thomas built." "Yes. He says it's just sitting there, collecting dust. They need the money for a car." Laura leaned back in her chair and sighed. "That sounds like him." For a moment, we both sat in silence. I could see the memory in her eyes. 10 years of trying to make a marriage work with a man who thought money could fix everything. He was different once, she said finally. Before the business failures, before the debt. But when things started to fall apart, he changed. He got desperate to prove himself. I know, I said. I kept hoping he'd find his way back, but he's lost now. I don't even recognize him anymore. Laura looked at me carefully, studying my face. And what are you going to do about the house? I hesitated. I hadn't said it out loud before, but the words were already written in my mind. I'm going to sell it, I said. She looked surprised. To him? No, I said quietly. To someone who will love it. Her expression changed, curiosity mixed with understanding. You mean me? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, and in that silence she knew I wasn't joking. Mrs. Hayes? Eleanor, she said slowly. You know what that would mean, right? He'll lose his mind when he finds out. I know, I said, but it's the only way to protect it. If I sell it to him, he'll drain it dry. If I sell it to you, it stays in hands that understand what it's worth. She leaned forward, her tone softer. This isn't about money for you, is it? I shook my head. No, it's about respect. He's treated me like I don't matter for years. That house is the only thing left that still feels like mine. Like Thomas is still here somehow. I won't let him take that too. Laura didn't speak for a while. She looked down at her cup thinking. Then she said, You know, when Mark and I divorced, I told myself I was done with his drama forever. But this feels different. It is, I said. It's not revenge. It's self-respect. That made her smile, a small, genuine one. You always had more strength than you gave yourself credit for. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Maybe. But I'm tired of feeling like I owe everyone everything. I've spent my whole life cleaning up after other people's choices. I just want to do something for me. Laura nodded slowly. Then let's make sure we do this right. We talked for almost an hour, going over details, now quietly, carefully. Laura was practical and sharp, just like I remembered. She said she could handle everything privately, no agents, no records that would reach Mark. She'd even use her maiden name. Before we left, we sat there for a minute, not saying anything. The rain outside had stopped, and sunlight was spilling through the window, warming the table between us. I reached across the table and touched her hand. Thank you, I said softly, for helping me do this. She squeezed my hand back. You're not alone, Eleanor, not this time. We both stood, and as she picked up her bag, she smiled again. Not the polite kind, but something real. Let's do it right, she said. I nodded. We will? As she walked out into the street, I sat for a moment longer, listening to the sound of the door closing behind her. It wasn't just a business plan anymore. It felt like the start of something I'd forgotten I still had. Control. When I left the cafe that day, I felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to my son's choices. I was making my own. The next few days moved slower than usual, but my mind didn't stop once. Every morning, I'd wake up earlier than I needed to. I'd make coffee, sit at the kitchen table, and go over the plan again in my head. The same steps, the same names, every little detail. Laura called me the morning after our meeting. Her voice was calm and steady. I've been thinking about how to do this quietly, she said. We'll use my legal name, Laura Kent, not my married one. Mark doesn't even know I went back to it. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That's good, I said. He'll never connect it to you. He won't, she replied. He doesn't pay attention to details unless they benefit him. We both laughed, the kind of laugh you share with someone who understands you too well. We met twice more that week. Each time we sat in her office, papers spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle. Laura handled most of it, the appraisal, the transfer forms, the notary contacts. I mostly just listened, nodded, and tried to keep my nerves from showing. At one point, she looked up from the paperwork and said, You know, Eleanor, you're not selling a house. I frowned a little. What do you mean? You're taking back your voice, she said simply. Something about those words stopped me. I hadn't thought about it like that. I thought I was just protecting what was mine. But when she said it that way, I realized how much I had been silenced over the years. By Mark, by guilt, by fear of being alone. For a second, I didn't know what to say. Then I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. It came out a little shaky, but it felt good. Laura smiled. There it is, she said. I was starting to wonder if you remembered how. We decided to drive out to Maplewood that weekend. She said she wanted to see the house in person before finishing the paperwork. I agreed, though a part of me was nervous. When we arrived, the sky was clear and the lake was calm. The cottage looked the same, weathered but strong. It had stood through storms just like I had. We walked through each room slowly. Laura was methodical, running her fingers along the walls, checking the windows, asking small questions about the plumbing and the foundation. But I could tell she wasn't just inspecting the property. She was feeling the place, understanding it. In the living room, she stopped and looked around. It's beautiful, she said quietly. You can feel the history in here. It's seen everything, I said. Good and bad. She smiled. That's what makes a place worth keeping. While Laura checked the porch, I heard a voice from behind me. Eleanor Hayes, is that you? I turned around and saw Harold Finch, my old neighbor from across the lake. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes were still kind. Well, I'll be, he said, stepping closer. Haven't seen you here in ages. Thought maybe your boy took over the place. I shook my head. No, Harold, not yet. He looked curious. You fixing it up to sell? I smiled, careful with my words. Something like that. He nodded slowly, glancing toward the woman standing on the porch. To your boy? I looked at Laura, who was pretending not to listen, and said softly, No, Harold, to someone better. He paused, studying my face, and I saw the moment he understood. He gave a small nod. You always did have more sense than people gave you credit for, he said. Don't worry, I won't say a word. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. He tipped his hat and walked off toward the road, whistling like nothing had happened. But I could feel his respect, and that meant something. When Laura came back inside, she asked who he was. I told her. He seems like a good man, she said. He is, I replied. He's one of the few who never treated me like I was fragile. We spent the next few hours cleaning and organizing. I wiped down the kitchen counters, dusted the shelves, and aired out the rooms. Laura handled the paperwork, sitting at the table Thomas had built all those years ago. Every so often, she'd ask a question and I'd answer without thinking. It felt natural. Two women working together, steady and quiet. At one point, we took a break and sat outside on the porch. The sun was starting to dip and the light over the lake was turning gold. I used to sit here every evening with Thomas, I said, looking out over the water. He'd talk about the future. He said this house would keep us together even when we were gone. Laura glanced at me. And do you think it has? I thought for a moment before answering. Maybe not in the way he meant, but it's kept me going. She nodded. That's enough reason to fight for it. We sat in silence for a while, just listening to the water. Then she said quietly, You know, when I left Mark, I promised myself I'd never get pulled into anything related to him again. But I think helping you might finally close that chapter for me too. I smiled. Then maybe we're both getting our closure. The next few days passed in a blur of signatures, phone calls, and quiet planning. Laura worked fast. She had connections and she knew how to make things happen quietly. Every evening she called to update me. Every time she did, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. On the morning we finalized everything, I met her at the cottage one last time. The papers were ready, the check was written, and everything was official. She handed me the documents and I ran my fingers over the signature. Laura Kent. Not Mitchell. Not my son's wife. Just her. Herself again. When everything was done, we sat by the lake together. The wind had picked up and small waves were breaking against the dock. The chime on the porch rang softly behind us. I can't believe it's really over, I said. It's not over, Laura said. It's just the part where you finally get to breathe. I looked out at the water, the sky, the trees moving gently in the wind. It all looked the same, but it felt different. Lighter. For the first time in years, I said quietly, I feel free. Laura smiled, resting her elbows on her knees. Freedom looks good on you, Eleanor. We sat there for a long time after that, not saying much. The sound of the chime, the wind, and the lake filled the silence between us. It wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful, like something broken had finally started to mend. That night, as I drove home, the check lay folded neatly in my purse, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the feeling, the quiet power of finally doing something for myself. The week after signing the first round of papers felt unreal. Everything looked the same, my small apartment, the same morning coffee, the same view of the street below, but underneath it all, something had shifted. It was as if I was walking through my life quietly holding a secret no one else could see. Laura worked fast. She sent me messages every day, short and to the point. Inspection complete. All documents confirmed. Final filing tomorrow. Her tone was always calm, steady. I think that's what I liked most about her. She never made a big deal out of anything. She just got things done. Meanwhile, Mark's calls didn't stop. The first day he called twice. The second day, 5 times. Then it became a constant rhythm. Calls, voicemails, texts, all with the same tone of forced patience that I knew well. Mom, did you think about what we talked about? It's not a big decision, you know. Amber already started looking at cars, so please don't make this complicated. Each time I just texted back the same thing. Still thinking? It was the easiest lie I ever told. I didn't block his number. I didn't want him to suspect anything. I just let him think I was doing what I'd always done. Waiting, hesitating, putting his comfort first. The truth was, every hour that passed brought me closer to being free of him. At the same time, in another world entirely, Amber was busy posting photos of herself sitting in a silver Porsche at a dealership in town. I saw it by accident when her post appeared on my social media feed. The caption said, "Manifesting my dream, Doc new car energy." I stared at that picture longer than I should have. She looked happy, her blonde hair perfect, her nails polished, her smile wide. She had no idea her dream was never going to happen. Not with my house, not with my money. The contrast between our worlds couldn't have been sharper. While she posed for cameras and hashtags, I sat at my kitchen table reading legal documents and signing my name with a pen that shook only once. The papers were simple enough. Laura had prepared everything. The cottage was officially being sold to Laura Kent. Private buyer, cash purchase, no contingencies, all clean, all legal. I didn't even have to go to her office again. She sent a courier with the final packet and waited on the phone while I signed. "Take your time," she said. "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. When I finished, she said quietly, "That's it, Eleanor. It's done. The papers will be filed with the county by tomorrow morning." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there, staring at my own signature on the last page. I'd written that name thousands of times in my life, on bills, on report cards, on birthday cards, but this one felt different. It was the first time it truly belonged to me. While I was still holding the pen, my phone buzzed again. Mark. I let it ring until it stopped. Then another message came in. "Mom, are you ignoring me?" I put the phone face down on the table and didn't reply. A few minutes later, another text arrived. This time from Laura. "Done. Papers filed." I read the message twice just to let it sink in. It was over. The house was sold. Quietly. Cleanly. Without him knowing a thing. I looked toward the window. Outside, the trees were moving in the wind. The same kind of wind that used to blow through the porch at Maplewood, carrying the sound of the chime Thomas hung there. For some reason, I imagined him there, sitting on the steps, smiling that small, patient smile he always had. He'd probably tell me he was proud of me, even if I'd taken too long to get here. I reached over to the small shelf by the window. Hanging there was a smaller wind chime, a replica I'd bought years ago after the original one started to tarnish. I touched it gently. It made a soft, clear sound. At that exact moment, the printer beside me finished its job, spitting out the last confirmation form Laura had emailed. The chime and the machine made noise at the same time. One mechanical, one human, and somehow they fit together perfectly. I laughed under my breath. "Even the universe knows," I said. I picked up the last page from the printer, looked at the signed line, and whispered, "Thomas, I did it." The wind outside grew a little stronger, and for a second I thought I heard the faint echo of the chime from Maplewood. It wasn't guilt I felt. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was something quieter, deeper, a kind of peace that comes only when you finally stop letting people take what they don't deserve. The next day, I woke up earlier than usual. The phone was already buzzing again, Mark's name flashing across the screen. But this time, I didn't feel anxious. I smiled, poured myself a cup of coffee, and let it ring. A week passed before it happened. I'd been waiting for it, though I didn't know exactly how or when it would come. The house was gone, the papers were filed, and the check was safely sitting in my desk drawer. Life should have felt normal again. But deep down, I knew the quiet wouldn't last. It was a Thursday morning, the coffee pot was still half full, and the sound of the radio filled the background when my phone started buzzing. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. Amber. Her voice came through the line before I could even say hello. "So," she said brightly, almost singing the words, "did you sell it? Which Porsche are we getting?" For a moment I didn't answer. I could hear her chewing gum, flipping through something, maybe a car magazine. I pictured her sitting cross-legged on their sofa, her phone in one hand, her future built on something that wasn't hers. I took a slow breath. "It's sold," I said evenly. She squealed. "You did? Oh my God. Mark's going to be so happy. So which Porsche? The silver or the coral? I told him the coral suits me better, but he says silver is more classic. You know men." Her laughter grated through the phone like glass against stone. I waited until she stopped talking. "Amber," I said quietly, "I didn't sell it to you." The silence that followed was sharp. "What do you mean?" "I sold it," I repeated, "to a private buyer." For a few seconds, all I could hear was her breathing. Then her voice went up an octave. "What private buyer? Who? When?" "It doesn't matter," I said. "It's done." "You can't just do that," Mark said. "That I should sell it," I interrupted gently. "And I did." There was another pause. I could almost hear her trying to make sense of it, her thoughts racing through disbelief, then panic. "I need to tell Mark," she muttered and hung up without another word. It didn't take long. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. Mark's name flashed across the screen. I answered, though my hand shook a little. "Mom." His voice was low and cold, the way it got when he was angry but trying to sound calm. "Amber says you sold the lake house." "That's right," I said. "To who?" "A private buyer." "What does that even mean?" He snapped. "You can't just sell it to some stranger without talking to me." "You told me to sell it, Mark," I said quietly. "So I did." He let out a harsh laugh, the kind that wasn't amused. "Don't twist my words. You knew what I meant. You were supposed to sell it and help us. Not this." "I sold it for a fair price," I said, still calm. "Everything's legal and final." He went silent for a moment, and then the shouting started. "You had no right?" I didn't flinch. "It was my name on the deed. I had every right." "You don't understand what you've done," he shouted. "You've, ruined everything." The words hit me harder than I wanted them to, not because of what he said, but because of how familiar it sounded. He didn't mean his plans were ruined. He meant his access to me, to what was mine, was gone. Before I could respond, I heard Amber in the background yelling something. Then she grabbed the phone. Her voice was sharp, full of anger that didn't sound like surprise, more like entitlement. "You ruined our future," she screamed. "Do you have any idea what we gave up waiting for this? Mark's been under so much pressure. You were supposed to help us." I almost laughed, but it came out as a quiet sigh instead. "I think you'll both survive," I said. "You're a selfish old woman," Amber shouted. "Are you?" I hung up. The line went dead, and the apartment was quiet again. I set the phone down on the table and took a deep breath. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear, from release. The storm had come, just as I expected, but it hadn't destroyed me. It had passed right through, leaving me standing. I walked to the window. The sky outside was gray, the kind of soft, cloudy gray that made everything look calmer than it really was. I opened the curtain a little and let the cool air in. On the windowsill hung my small silver wind chime. It caught the breeze and rang once, a clear, gentle sound that filled the room. I smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep inside. "Thomas," I whispered, "I did it." The chime rang again, a little stronger this time, almost like an answer. I stood there for a while, listening to that sound, letting the peace sink in. The noise, the shouting, the guilt, it was all behind me now. All that was left was the quiet hum of freedom, and for the first time in a long time, that quiet felt good. That night, I went to bed early. My phone stayed silent and the house was still, but I knew this wasn't the end. Mark wasn't the kind of man who let go easily. I didn't hear from Mark for almost a week after that last call. At first, I thought maybe the silence meant he'd finally accepted it, that the anger had burned itself out, but deep down, I knew him better than that. Mark never let go of anything he thought belonged to him. When the phone stayed quiet for 7 straight days, I told myself not to worry, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something. And I was right. Mark. The road to Maplewood looked the same as it always had, but it didn't feel the same. The air was colder, sharper, and the sky hung heavy and gray above the lake. The trees were bare now, their branches reaching like arms over the narrow dirt road that wound toward the water. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The sound of gravel under the tires was loud in the silence. He hadn't been here in years. Not since before the divorce. Not since before everything started falling apart. As the car turned the final corner, the cottage came into view. Small, steady, familiar. For a moment, his breath caught. It looked exactly like he remembered. The pale blue siding, the porch, the old wind chime swaying in the breeze. For a split second, something soft flickered through him. He saw himself as a boy again, standing on that same porch, barefoot, his father's fishing pole too big for his hands. He could still feel his father's rough fingers guiding the line, hear his deep voice saying, "Patience, son, let the water come to you." He remembered the laughter, the smell of the lake, the sound of the wind through the trees. It all came back at once. The warmth, the comfort, the sense that he belonged somewhere. And then it was gone. Because standing in front of the house now was a man in paint-splattered jeans, holding a brush, calmly painting the fence a fresh shade of white. Mark parked the car and got out slowly. The wind whipped across the driveway, carrying the smell of fresh paint and wet leaves. He slammed the door harder than he needed to. The man looked up. "Morning," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Mark frowned. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly. "I'm just fixing this up for Ms. Kent." For a moment the name didn't register. It hung there in the cold air, meaningless. Then it hit. Kent. He took a step closer, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry, who did you say?" The man blinked, a little confused. "Ms. Kent. Laura Kent. She bought the place last week." It felt like the ground shifted under him. The cold air, the smell of paint, the sound of the lake, all of it blurred into one dizzying wave. Laura Kent, not just any buyer, his ex-wife. Mark's breath came fast now. He stared at the porch, at the door she must have unlocked, at the windows she must have opened to let in the same air that once belonged to him. His chest tightened. It wasn't just anger, it was humiliation. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears. He reached out and grabbed one of the wooden fence posts the man had just painted. His hand slipped and the edge of a nail caught his skin. Blood welled up between his fingers, bright and sharp against the white wood. He didn't even notice the pain. He looked up at the lake again, the same place his father taught him to fish, the same place his mother used to sit and read while he played in the water. It was all still here, but none of it was his anymore. The man went back to painting, unaware of the storm standing behind him. Mark stayed frozen, his eyes fixed on the house. "She sold it to my ex-wife," he whispered under his breath. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Heavy, final, impossible to take back. He took a step backward, his breathing uneven. His mind raced through every conversation with his mother, every text, every still-thinking message. She'd played him. Both of them had. The anger rose so fast it scared him. His face burned, his heart hammered. For a second he thought about storming inside, about demanding answers, about making them both explain why. But then he saw the new locks on the door, the fresh paint, the calm, unbothered man with the brush. This wasn't his anymore. He turned back toward the car, his shoes crunching over the gravel. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of the chime from the porch, the same one his father had hung there decades ago. It rang once, clear and sharp. He stopped walking. For a moment the sound froze him. It was almost like the lake itself was laughing. Not cruelly, but knowingly. Like it understood something he didn't yet. He looked up at the sky, gray and endless, and whispered again, this time with more venom. "She sold it to my ex-wife." The words came out like smoke, disappearing into the wind. He climbed back into the car and slammed the door. His reflection in the rear-view mirror startled him. Red-eyed, pale, nothing like the man he used to be. When he finally turned the key, his hands were still shaking. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence, but the sound didn't comfort him. As he drove away, the camera would have caught it. The blood still fresh on his hand, the tightness in his jaw, the lake shrinking in the distance behind him. Back in town, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, unaware of where he was, unaware of what he'd just learned. The phone lay silent beside me. The only sound in the room was the wind chime by the window, gentle, steady, calm. If I'd known what he discovered that day, I might have felt afraid. But at that moment, all I felt was peace. It happened 2 days after Laura officially moved into the lake house. I was in the living room with her that morning, helping unpack some dishes and talking about small things, groceries, paint colors, how the porch needed new lights. Everything felt calm, ordinary. For a little while it felt like life had gone back to normal. Then we heard a car outside. It stopped so suddenly that we both looked up. The sound of a door slamming followed, and then the footsteps, fast, angry, heavy, moving up the porch steps. Laura went still. "Stay here," she said, setting down the box in her hands. But before she reached the door, the knocking started. It wasn't polite or patient. It was hard and fast, the kind that doesn't wait for permission. She opened the door just enough to see, and I heard her take a small breath. "It's Mark," she said quietly, and before she could say anything else, the door was pushed open. He came in like a storm, his face red, his eyes wild, his voice already raised. "You two planned this?" he shouted. "You think I don't know what's going on?" Laura stood between him and me, calm but firm. "Mark, you need to step outside," she said. "You have no right to be here." He pointed at her, his hand shaking. "Don't tell me what I can or can't do. This is my family's house." I stood up slowly from the chair near the fireplace. My heart was beating fast, but my voice came out steady. "It's not yours anymore, Mark. The house is sold." He turned to me, his voice trembling with anger. "You sold it to her? My ex-wife. How could you do that?" Laura didn't raise her voice. She said quietly, "You did this to yourself, Mark. You pushed too far." He laughed in disbelief. "You planned this together. You wanted to humiliate me. You knew what this place meant to me." "No," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "This place meant something to your father and me. You turned it into a way to make money." He took a step closer to me, and I could see the anger in his face turn into something else. Panic. "That house was my inheritance," he said. I shook my head. "Inheritance isn't something you demand, Mark. It's something you earn." For a moment he looked lost, like he didn't know what to say next. His hand brushed against the table, and I saw the papers there. Laura's closing documents, the proof that everything was official. He looked at them like they were poison. Then he slammed his hand against the table hard enough that one of the glasses tipped over. "You had no right," he shouted again. Laura took a step forward. "That's enough," she said firmly. "If you don't leave right now, I'll have to call the police and file trespassing charges." He turned to her furious. "You'd love that, wouldn't you? Getting me arrested, making me look like the bad guy again." Her face didn't change. "You're doing that. Yourself, Mark." The room went quiet for a few seconds. I could hear the wind outside moving through the trees, the faint creak of the porch under his car's weight. Then we heard footsteps behind him. Amber appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Mark," she said softly. "Please, let's go." He didn't turn around. "Get back to the car." "Mark, please." "Go," he snapped louder this time. Amber looked at me, and for a second I saw fear in her eyes. I realized she wasn't afraid of me or Laura. She was afraid of him. She stepped backward, out of sight, and didn't come back. Mark turned back toward me. His voice dropped lower now, but it was full of bitterness. "You'll regret this?" he said. "Both of you." I looked at him for a long moment. He was standing in the same spot where his father once stood, but there was nothing of Thomas in him now. "No, Mark," I said quietly. "You're the one who'll regret this. I've made peace with my choices. Can you say the same?" For a second, his face changed. It wasn't anger anymore. It was hurt. But then it hardened again. He turned toward the door, muttering something I couldn't catch. Laura stepped aside, but didn't move away. "If you come back without permission," she said evenly, "I'll file charges. That's not a threat. It's a promise." He glared at her, then at me, his jaw tight, his eyes wet. "You chose her over your own son," he said. I shook my head. "No, Mark. I chose peace." He didn't respond. He just opened the door and walked out. We heard the engine start, the tires spinning on gravel, and then the car disappeared down the road. The silence that followed felt heavy. I sat back down, realizing how tired I was. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from everything that had just happened. Laura locked the door and turned around. Her expression stayed calm, but I could tell she was shaken too. "He's unraveling," she said quietly. I nodded. "I know." We both stood there for a while, looking at the empty doorway. Outside, the lake was calm, the sky gray, and the air smelled of rain. It was strange. Even after all that shouting, the house itself felt peaceful. Laura walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside just a little. "He's not going to let this go easily," she said. "I know," I said again, "but at least now it's clear. There's no pretending anymore." She looked at me and gave a small, tired smile. "You did the right thing, Eleanor." "I know I did," I said, "but right things aren't always easy." We sat down at the table again, but neither of us spoke for a while. The only sound was the faint ringing of the wind chime outside, moving in the breeze. It was the same sound I'd heard all my life, gentle, steady, honest. And as I listened, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not victory, just quiet acceptance. Thomas used to say, "The lake always reflected the truth no matter how much you tried to hide it." Looking out that window now, I finally understood what he meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me wonder if he'd come back. I didn't know it then, but that confrontation was only the beginning of something far worse. That night was colder than usual. The air outside felt heavy, the kind that makes you check your locks twice before going to bed. Laura was staying at the lake house. She'd been there for a week now, settling in, unpacking boxes, putting things in order. She told me earlier that day she finally felt like the place was starting to feel like home again. It was almost midnight when it happened. She was sitting in the living room with a blanket over her legs, reading one of those mystery novels she liked. The lights were low, the house quiet except for the wind outside. Every now and then she could hear the faint sound of the wind chime on the porch. Then she heard something else, a soft noise, like a footstep. She thought maybe it was the wind against the porch, but then it came again. A slow scrape, a faint crunch of gravel. She lowered her book and listened. Through the window she saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the glass. At first it didn't look like a person, just a shape, dark and still. But then it moved again, closer. The outline of a man's face appeared behind the reflection of the lamp. Laura froze. She didn't need to see clearly to know who it was. Mark. He was standing outside right in front of the window, his hands pressed against the glass. His face looked pale and hollow, his eyes fixed on the inside of the house. Laura didn't move. She watched him, her heartbeat loud in her chest. For a moment, he didn't do anything. He just stared into the house like someone trying to remember something that was already gone. Then he spoke, barely more than a whisper. "It's still my father's house." The words fogged the glass. He stood there for another second, then took a step back. Laura's hand trembled as she reached for the lamp beside her. She turned it on. The room filled with light, bright and sudden. Mark flinched like the light had burned him. His eyes widened, and then he turned and ran. Across the porch, down the steps, into the darkness. The sound of his footsteps disappeared fast, swallowed by the wind. Laura stood there for a long time, staring at the empty window. Her pulse was still racing, but she made herself move. She locked every door, checked every window twice, and finally sat down to steady her breathing. She thought about calling the police, but decided to wait until morning. Instead, she picked up her phone and called me. The ringing pulled me out of sleep. My first thought was that something had happened to her. I answered on the second ring. "Laura?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "He was here, Eleanor." I sat up straight. "Who?" "Mark," she said. "He was standing outside the window. He didn't try to break in, but he was just there, staring." For a moment, I couldn't say anything. My mouth went dry. "Did he say anything?" She hesitated. "Just one thing. He said, 'It's still my father's house.' Then he ran." I didn't realize my hands were shaking until I saw the phone trembling between my fingers. "Are you safe?" I asked. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I locked everything, but I thought you should know." "Thank you," I whispered. After we hung up, I sat there in the dark, the phone still in my hand. I could hear the wind outside my own window. It sounded stronger now, colder. I went to the living room and pulled the curtain aside. The street was empty, quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something in Mark had crossed a line he wouldn't come back from. On the small table near the window, my own wind chime was moving wildly in the air from a draft. The sound filled the room, sharper, louder than usual, almost desperate. I watched it swing back and forth, the metal pieces clinking together, and I said quietly to myself, "My son's turning into a stranger." The chime kept ringing, the sound echoing in the dark apartment, long after I'd turned away from the window. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound outside felt like footsteps. I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. It didn't take long for things to get worse. After that night when Laura saw Mark outside her window, the police came by the next morning. They were polite and careful, asked her to describe what she saw, and told her to call immediately if he came back. They said they would talk to him, issue a warning if needed. She thanked them and said she hoped it wouldn't come to that, but it did. The next week, I got a letter in the mail. I recognized the handwriting right away. Amber's. It was written in rushed, uneven lines like she'd been shaking while she wrote it. Eleanor, I'm leaving Mark. He's not the same anymore. He talks to the walls, to himself, to pictures of you and Laura. He says you've both brainwashed him. I'm scared. I don't know what he might do next. Please, be careful. Amber. I read it 3 times. The words didn't make sense at first, like they were from a stranger's life, not mine. Then they started to sink in. I folded the letter and set it on the table. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The idea of my son, my little boy who once brought me dandelions and laughed by the lake, talking to the walls, losing touch with everything real, was something I couldn't understand. Laura called that afternoon. Her voice was steady, but I could tell she was worried. Amber left him, she said. She sent me the same letter she sent you. I just got it, I whispered. He's been driving by the house every night, she continued. My security camera catches his car around 9 o'clock, sometimes later. He doesn't stop anymore. He just sits at the end of the driveway. The police said it's not technically a crime unless he steps onto the property, but they told me to keep documenting it. Are you scared? I asked. I'm not scared, she said after a pause, but I'm careful. At the same time, in another world entirely, Mark was falling apart. Harold, my old neighbor, called me one evening. His voice was uneasy. Eleanor, he said, I don't want to worry you, but your boy's been parking near the lake most nights. I see his car down by the dock. Lights off, just sitting there. Sometimes for an hour or more. My throat tightened. Are you sure it's him? Pretty sure, Harold said quietly. He looks different, though. Thinner, worn down. I tried waving once, but he didn't even see me. I thanked him and told him to lock his doors just in case. When I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than usual. I called Laura again that night and told her what Harold said. She didn't sound surprised. I figured as much, she said. The camera caught his car again last night. I'm filing a report tomorrow. I also set up another camera at the side entrance, just to be safe. You're doing the right thing, I told her. I'm trying, she said softly. If he crosses the line, I'll press charges. Later that week, I learned from one of Mark's old friends that he'd quit his job 2 months earlier. No one had heard from him since. His apartment windows were covered with paper and tape, the blinds always drawn. I couldn't help but picture it. Mark inside, pacing the floors, walls closing in, the air stale and dark. They said he'd started pinning photos to the wall. Me, Laura, the lake house. He'd drawn lines between them in red string, like trying to map out some conspiracy that only made sense in his head. According to his friend, Mark kept repeating the same thing over and over. They stole it from me. They brainwashed her. When I heard that, something broke inside me. It wasn't anger anymore, it was grief. The kind that doesn't make you cry right away, but sits deep in your chest and won't move. Laura sent me a message a few days later with a video file attached. This is from the security camera last night, she wrote. I didn't want to open it, but I did. The footage was grainy, dark. The outline of a car sat at the edge of the driveway. For a long time, nothing happened. Then a figure stepped out. It was Mark. He stood there for a few seconds looking at the house, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. Then he took a few steps closer, staring straight into the camera, before turning back toward the road. That was it. No violence, no shouting, just him standing there lost. Still, I could feel the danger in it, not from what he did, but from how empty he looked. I called Laura immediately. I saw it, I said quietly. I've already spoken with the police, she replied. They'll give him one more warning. After that, if he comes back, it's trespassing. Be careful, I told her. I will, she said. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind was loud outside, and the chime by the window moved nonstop. I sat in the dark with a cup of tea that went cold before I even touched it. I kept thinking about the boy he used to be. The boy who laughed with his father on the dock, The boy who said he'd take care of me when I got old. Somewhere along the way, that boy disappeared, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. When I finally went to bed, I played one of the voice recordings I'd kept on my phone. It was from the security audio Laura sent me, a short clip where Mark's voice could be heard faintly through the wind. He said it again, the same words he'd whispered at her window. "It's my father's house." Hearing it broke something in me. I lay there listening to his voice, tears running down my face, wishing I could reach through the sound and pull him back from whatever darkness had taken hold of him, but it was too late. The son I knew was gone, and I wasn't sure if he'd ever come back. By the end of that week, I stopped answering unknown calls. Every shadow outside my window made my heart jump. I had no idea how close things were to breaking completely. It was raining that night. The kind of rain that makes the world quiet, like everything is holding its breath. I was asleep when it happened, but I didn't know until later how close everything came to ending. While I slept, dreaming of the past, Mark was driving through that rain. The roads around Maplewood were narrow and dark, the kind that twist through the woods with no lights to guide you. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping a red gasoline can. The passenger seat beside him held a lighter. Later, the police would tell me he was talking to himself the whole drive. His words didn't make much sense, but they recorded them from his dash camera. He kept saying, "I'll free Dad's spirit. I'll set him free." He reached the lake house sometime after midnight. The storm had grown heavier, the rain came down hard, bouncing off the hood of the car and soaking him the moment he stepped out. He didn't seem to notice. He walked straight to the porch, the gas can swinging in his hand. Inside, Laura was asleep. She had left a small lamp on in the hallway, just enough light to keep the house from feeling too empty. She told me later she woke up because she smelled something sharp, that kind of smell that doesn't belong in a place made of wood. At first, she thought it was just the rain and the old pipes. Then she heard the sound, a slow splashing, liquid hitting the floorboards. She got up, grabbed her phone, and crept toward the living room. Through the window, she saw him. Mark. Standing there in the rain, his hair plastered to his face, empty eyes staring at the door. He was pouring gasoline across the porch, across the steps, onto the wood that Thomas had once built. For a few seconds, she couldn't move. Then her instincts kicked in. She backed away, dialed 911 and whispered, "It's my ex-husband. He's outside my house with gasoline. Please hurry." The dispatcher told her to stay where she was, to lock the doors, and keep talking until officers arrived. Laura did what she was told, though she could hardly breathe. Outside, Mark finished pouring the gasoline. He stood there with the empty can at his feet, shaking. His voice cracked as he whispered, "It's still my father's house. She poisoned it. I'll free him from her." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the lighter, and flicked it once. The small flame appeared, weak and trembling in the wind. And somewhere, miles away, I started dreaming. I dreamed of Thomas standing by the lake, the same place where he used to fish. The water was still, the sky gray, and he was smiling. Calm, kind, the way I always remembered him. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me. Then the wind started to rise, moving through the trees, rippling the water. Thomas turned his head toward the house in the distance and said softly, "It's not time yet." In my dream, I didn't understand what he meant. But when I woke up, later, I realized that maybe, somehow, the wind was real. Because at that same moment, outside Maplewood, the wind grew stronger. The rain came harder, and before Mark could drop the lighter, a gust blew through the porch, catching him off guard. The flame flickered once, then went out completely. The lighter slipped from his wet fingers and fell into a puddle. He tried again, his hands shaking, but the rain was too strong. The matches he took out next were soaked through. He struck one, then another. Each time, the tiny flame died before it could live. By the time the police arrived, he was still kneeling on the porch, his hands covered in mud, his face twisted with rage and confusion. The blue and red lights flashed through the trees, cutting through the storm. "Sir, put your hands where we can see them," an officer shouted. Mark didn't move at first. He just stared at the wet wood, at the puddles reflecting the sky as if he couldn't believe his plan hadn't worked. Then, suddenly, he stood up and yelled, his voice raw and desperate, "She's poisoning my father's house." The officers moved fast. They pulled him back, pinned his arms, and took the lighter from his pocket. He struggled, shouting the same words again and again until his voice broke. Then he stopped fighting. The rain kept falling as they led him to the car. Laura watched from the window, her phone still in her hand. She didn't say anything. She just stood there watching them drive him away. The rain on the glass blurred her vision, but it didn't matter. She could barely tell where her tears ended and the storm began. After the police left, she went out onto the porch. The air smelled of gasoline and wet wood. The wind chime above her door was swinging wildly, the sound sharp and uneven. She reached up and stopped it with her hand. Miles away, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Outside my apartment window, the wind was howling. The chime I'd hung there years ago was ringing hard against the glass, louder than it ever had before. I didn't need the phone call to know something had happened. I could feel it. But when it came, Laura's voice trembling on the other end, telling me everything, I cried anyway. Not just for what could have happened, but for what already had. Because the son I once knew was gone. The man who tried to burn down his father's house wasn't the boy who once built sandcastles by that lake. The wind chime rattled again, filling the room with sound. I pressed my hand against my chest and whispered, "Thomas, I think you stopped him." The storm outside carried on. The wind moved through the city, through the trees, through the distance, until it reached the lake house again, where the chime there rang just as wildly, echoing across the water. That night changed everything. Mark was alive, but something in him had broken for good, and I knew the real fire had only just begun. They kept Mark in the psychiatric hospital for 72 hours. When the police called to tell me, I didn't know whether to feel relief or heartbreak, maybe both. The doctor's voice on the phone was kind but careful. He said Mark had suffered what they called a stress-induced psychotic episode, the kind that builds slowly, fed by grief and guilt that never gets faced. "Unresolved grief," he said softly. "It's been there a long time." When I went to see Mark the next morning, the sky was pale and quiet after the storm. The hospital was small, just outside Burlington, clean but not cold. I could hear the low hum of machines and the echo of doors closing somewhere down the hall. They brought me into a visiting room separated by a glass partition. He was already there, sitting on the other side, wearing light blue hospital clothes. His hair was damp, his eyes tired. For a moment I just looked at him. Not the man who had frightened us all, but the boy I once raised. He looked up slowly. "Mom," he said. His voice was rough, smaller than I remembered. I nodded. "Hi, Mark." There was a long silence. Then he asked quietly, "Do you hate me?" The question hit hard, but I shook my head. "No," I said. "I don't hate you." He looked down at his hands. "I think I hated myself," he whispered. I wanted to reach through the glass and hold his hand, but all I could do was press my palm against the divider. He looked up and did the same. For a few seconds, it felt like the distance between us disappeared. The nurse came in to tell me our time was almost up. I told Mark I'd come back the next day. He nodded, his eyes closing as if even that small promise gave him rest. When I stepped back into the hallway, I saw Laura waiting near the entrance. She'd come with papers in her hand, the documents for the restraining order, but when she looked at me, she folded them and shook her head. "I'm not filing them," she said quietly. I stared at her, surprised. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Justice doesn't always need punishment," she said. "Sometimes it's enough to know the truth has caught up to someone." I didn't have the strength to answer, so I just reached out and hugged her. It felt strange at first. This woman who used to be my daughter-in-law, now my friend. Together we walked down the hall toward the ward. Through the small window in the door, we could see Mark asleep on his bed. His face looked peaceful for the first time in years. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. As we turned to leave, I noticed a small wind chime hanging near the nurse's station. It must have been there for decoration, simple metal shaped like a leaf. But when the air conditioning kicked on, it moved gently, letting out a soft, familiar sound. It rang just once, clear and quiet, like a whisper in the distance. And for a moment I let myself believe it was Thomas, reminding me that even after everything burned down, something still survived. When I left the hospital, the air smelled of rain and new beginnings. I didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of it. 6 months passed. The seasons had changed, and so had we. The worst of everything was behind us now, though the memories still lingered, like echoes that slowly fade but never fully disappear. Mark was living in town again. After his release from the hospital, one of the doctors helped him find a small job at a legal aid office. He worked as a paralegal, answering phones, organizing files, helping people who couldn't afford lawyers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. He called me every Sunday. Sometimes we met for lunch. He was quieter now, gentler. There were moments when his eyes would wander, and I could see the guilt in them, but there was also something new. Effort. He was trying, and for me that was enough. Laura and I kept in touch too. She sent me photos of the cottage as it changed. New paint, repaired porch steps, flowers blooming by the dock again. When she finally invited me to visit, I said yes without hesitation. It was early summer when I drove out to Maplewood Lake again. The road felt softer this time, the air warm and full of the smell of pine and water. When I turned the corner and saw the house, my breath caught. It looked beautiful, restored, alive, but still familiar. She hadn't changed what mattered, the shape, the colors, the feeling. The wind chime still hung on the porch, shining in the sunlight. Laura came out to meet me, smiling. "You made it," she said, hugging me like family. "You've done wonders with it," I said, looking around. The garden was full of color again, roses, lavender, even small white daisies like the ones Thomas used to plant by the mailbox. Laura led me to the back, where a wooden pergola stood near the edge of the lawn. It was new, simple but strong, built from light cedar. On one of the beams hung the old wind chime, cleaned, polished, and swaying gently in the breeze. Above it, a small plaque was carved with the words, "For those who learn to love twice." Laura smiled when she saw me reading it. "For Thomas," she said softly, "and for you." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the chime, the sunlight glinting off its edges, and the reflection dancing across the water. The wind moved through the pergola and the chime began to sing, a sound I hadn't heard so clearly in years. Not sorrowful, not haunting, just peaceful. "He'd be proud," I said finally, my voice steady. "Of both of us." Laura nodded. "Maybe he's still here," she said. I smiled. Maybe he never left. We sat together for a while on the bench beneath the pergola. The air was warm and the lake shimmered like glass. The world felt still again, but in a good way this time. Not empty, just calm. I thought about everything that had happened, the pain, the fear, the anger, and the slow climb back towards something like forgiveness. Life had burned down to ashes once, but somehow we'd rebuilt from what was left. When it was time to go, Laura walked me to the car. I turned one last time to look at the house, the lake, the chime moving gently in the wind. It rang again, clear and soft, the sound carrying across the water. And as I stood there, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't come all at once, the kind that grows quietly, day by day, after you've lost everything and learned to start again. I took a deep breath and said, mostly to myself, if I've learned anything, it's never too late to choose peace. The wind blew once more, and the chime answered, its sound light and endless, fading into the calm air over the lake.